So as I said, a very warm welcome to everybody. And we are here at the end of quite an epic series, actually. It's been nodding, is it that long? This is week 9, and we've had sort of 8 weeks leading up to this, and I'm just going to give a very quick recap on what we have covered. So the series that we're sort of starting to draw to a close, we've got one more next week, is the path to awakening, how to make it happen. So we began by looking at the 5 mental states that you need to do anything at all, actually, in order to sort of have the resolve and the engagement to do anything at all. So all the way back in week 1, we had emotional engagement, and then we looked at resolve, deciding what to do. Recollection and attentiveness, remembering, having a sort of continuity of effort, absorption, concentration, focus, and then penetration, sort of bringing our analytical intelligence to bear on what we're doing. And then we moved into the 6 paramitars. So paramitars are qualities that must be fulfilled by a bodhisattva in order to realize their ideal. And a bodhisattva is somebody who wishes to gain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, not simply themselves. And those qualities: generosity, ethical practice, patience, virya, energy in pursuit of the good, and meditation. Sadharaja took us through meditation last week. So we've had all of that. That's been 7 weeks, which is basically covering. This is a copy of the Bodhicaryavatara, the text that we've been looking at. So that's that bit. And now we've got to chapter 9, which is entitled The Perfection of Understanding. You could say the perfection of wisdom. And this is the first verse of this text. And it says, of this chapter, sorry. And it says, "It is for the sake of understanding," or you could say for the sake of wisdom, "that the Buddha taught this entire collection of preparations." So this entire collection of preparations, everything we've covered in the last 8 weeks is leading up to this. This is what it's all about. "Therefore, in a desire to put an end to suffering, one should develop understanding, or one should develop wisdom." So it's all leading up to this. So what is it, this wisdom? What is it? Well, I can tell you, famously, beyond words and concepts. Language breaks down. It's indescribable, actually. So I'm not going to be able to tell you what it is. You'll go and have a cup of tea. But I can give you an idea. I can give you an idea of something that is said in chapter 9, some things that are said in it. I'm going to be honest with you, some things that are said in chapter 9, right over my head. So I'm not going to be embarking on those. But the bits that I can make sense of, and I'm going to be talking about what others wiser than me have said about it. I've listened to several talks and read a few things on the subject. And just a sort of an idea of how we might relate to it, how it might actually bear upon our lives. It's quite possible that you're going to come away with more questions than answers after this talk. And I can only apologise. That's the nature of the material that we're dealing with, really. So hold on to your hats. And yeah, I really invite you, particularly if you're very new, just see what takes your interest. Don't worry too much if there's things that sort of don't make sense. That's quite a good caveat for a talk, isn't it? Don't worry, it doesn't make sense. So I'm relying on, I listened to a couple of talks by Jnanavacha. Jnanavacha is an order member who lives in London. He's our president, actually, president of this centre. And he's very good on this topic. So I listened to a couple of his talks, and I'm going to be quoting from him a bit. And Jnanavacha said at the beginning of one of his talks on this, the essence of Buddhist wisdom is seeing that we don't exist in the way we think we do. Nothing exists like that. So Buddhist wisdom is seeing that we don't exist in the way we think we do. Nothing exists like that. So that begs the question, really, doesn't it? So how do we think we exist? And I'll speak for myself. I think of myself as a me, as an I, as a sort of a fixed being in a way. My name is Kalyanadhi. I live in Cambridge. This is my body. I've got my mind and my thoughts. I've got my memories. I can remember something I did 10 years ago. That's me. That's me. And I'm separate from you. I'm separate from Anna. She's a separate being. I'm separate from Nagavira. Separate being. This is me. And fundamentally, what chapter 9 of the Bodhicaryavatara does, and actually what any Buddhist wisdom teaching does, is pulls that right apart, sort of pulls that rug out from under you. And one of the things that it does is it details a couple of sort of practices or reflections that help us investigate our sense of self and investigate our sense of identity, and asks you basically, where can you find a fixed bit of you? Where can you find sort of an essence of you? So one of the first one is breaking the self sort of down into parts, as it were. So here am I, I'm sitting here. This is me. This is me. Okay. But actually, if I start to really look at that, so, okay, this is me, this is my hair. But actually, just a few days ago, I had a good amount of hair chopped off, actually about this much hair chopped off. And then it's on the hairdressing room floor. So is that me? Is that still me? Because this is me. But then if you chop that off, that bit on the floor, is that me? And then it gets swept away, put in the bin. When does that stop? You know, when do I stop identifying that as me? But it was definitely a part of me. Nails, same thing. You think, oh, this is a hard, solid bit of me. This is me. But when you cut your nails, as we do fairly regularly, the bits of nail clippings in the bin, are they you? Our skin, so this is, you know, you can touch this. This is solid. This must be part of me. But of course, you know, your skin cells are constantly being sloughed, which is a word I love, sloughed off. They're changing all the time. And actually, I'm not very good with sciencey things, but I do know that they've really tried to see where skin sort of begins and ends with, I don't know, microscopes or something. But there's no real. It's permeable. It's porous, isn't it? So there are things coming in and out of it. So there's no real hard barrier there of what's me and what's out there, so to speak. It's constantly shifting, it's constantly moving. And apparently every 7 years, all of the cells in our body will have changed and been replaced. So the person, me sitting here with my cells, is a completely different set of cells to 7 years ago. So there's nothing, the more you look at it, and you can go sort of deeper and deeper into that, what's fixed, what's definitely there in yourself, in your experience. And it's a practice of, just as with any Buddhist practice, the Buddha really encouraged people, well, just have a look, have an investigate, see if this is true for you. So this is an invitation, just sort of have a look and see, what can you find that's fixed, definitely you. And the teaching says that this can apply to absolutely anything. Absolutely anything. So one of the verses in the Bodhicaryavatara, put my laptop and tap it, says, just as the trunk of a banana tree is shown to be empty of real existence when it is broken down into its separate parts, in the same way we see that the I is not a real entity when we hunt for it by analysis. And you can sort of carry that on a bit with, so my mind, okay, so maybe my body is in this process, but actually my mind's even more in process, you know, clearly than my body. Like, my thoughts are going so quickly in and out of my mind. They're changing so fast, and there's nothing really to hang on to there. So what about my memories? What about my memories? Am I my memories? When you really start to look at memories, they're very unreliable. You can tell the same memory several times and do it completely differently and remember different things at different times. And we have a practice in Triratna, in this movement of telling life stories as a way to sort of deepen our connections. And after you've done that 2 or 3 times, you realise what a subjective process that is. You end up telling a completely different story each time. You pull out different things. And what I've realised in doing that is that it's very dependent on the mood, the situation I am in at the time I'm telling it. It's dependent upon the sort of conditions around me at that time that shapes what I then sort of pick out from the past. So what in that is reliable in a way, or a constant? Vidanya, and I just want to say, and I think we have mentioned him quite a bit, but Vidanya is an order member in Sheffield, and he's the person who originally put this series of talks together incredibly skillfully on this old Buddhist text, the Bodhicaryavatara. And in his talk that he did on this topic, wisdom, he says, "This stream of mental moments I call my mind, these ever-changing elements that are my body, are not something that exists in its own right. Not something that exists in its own right." It's quite it's challenging stuff. And the other method that the Bodhicharya sort of talks about, and if the breaking apart thing doesn't really do it for you, or you're not sort of, I don't know, there's always a different one that you can look at. And this is sort of thinking about looking at the conditions around us that enable us to be. And if they're not there, we wouldn't be here. So I'm going to use myself as an example. So what's needed for me, Kalyanadhi, to be sitting here? Well, if you go right back, so my mum and dad were needed to be. Them to be in the form that they were, they needed their mum and their dad. And their mum and their dad needed their mum and their dad. And you can quite quickly see you could go a very, very long way with that, involving a vast number of people. And it really blows my mind when I think about it, because if there's any change in any single one of those people, I wouldn't be the collection of the being that I am here now. So utterly interdependent on all of those beings, going back and back and back. I find that extraordinary to really think about. And then I need warmth, I need heat, like most sort of living beings. So, I mean, in my case, I'm not a wild woman of the woods. I need heating and energy, and that comes from the sun. So the sun definitely needs to be there. I need water to drink. So that involves pipes and reservoirs and ultimately rain. So many different factors involved in all of those things. And I need food. So again, in my case, I need shops, farmers, the sun and the rain. And you can see, I mean, just in that small selection of things, there are so many variables and conditions that go into all of those things, that go into me just sort of being here at this point in time. And you can apply that to absolutely anything, is what the Buddhist teaching is saying, absolutely anything. Animals, plants, our being, anything at all. Bhante Sangharachita, who's the man who founded our movement, my teacher, he says, "Nothing lives or moves under its own power, but within a multiplicity of conditions." Nothing lives or moves under its own power, but within a multiplicity of conditions. And I think I really like just the use of the word power there, because I think particularly in our society, we live in this sort of, when you hear, don't you, sort of like the cult of the individual, and like we've got to be self-realizing sort of driven ourselves and, you know, achieving things. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with achieving things. Hello.
Is there someone in a Volvo 8x60?
Yeah.
I just moved it. It's swap out cars.
Yeah.
No, that's all right. It's a tricky car park. It happens. So yeah, what was I? Yes. So the idea that we're sort of moving within our own power, and you know, you can do this, and of course there is something to be said for achievement and having a wish and having a drive for something. But the idea that we can do it on our own, you know, we can sort of drive ourselves, is completely wrong. Actually, it's a complete fallacy. We're completely interdependent upon so many things in order for us just to be sitting here breathing at this point in time. There are so many things we don't have any control over, actually, in our world. So everything's constantly interacting with the environment. The Bodhicaryavatara in this chapter we're looking at, nowhere is there a single cause that has the power to produce everything. Nowhere is there a single cause that has the power to produce everything. So the Bodhicaryavatara describes us as a bundle devoid of self, a bundle devoid of self. So like a bundle of processes, nothing inherent, completely interdependent with the world around us. And that is what is meant by conditioned existence. You will often hear the phrase, the conditioned or conditioned existence. That is what that means. Everything is dependent upon other conditions. And if you want a really beautiful illustration of that at the moment, David Attenborough's latest thing on the BBC, The Green Planet, it's a really lovely illustration of exactly this truth that Buddhism's pointing to. So before we get too alarmed, Buddhism is not saying that there's nothing there. It's not saying that we're sort of an empty void of nothingness. It's simply, I say simply, that's possibly not the right word, but simply that there's nothing fixed or unchanging within us. We're constantly sort of processing and flowing. Our physical bodies, our minds, everything is in a constant state of change, continual process, functioning over time. For practical purposes, we put labels on these things. So for practical purposes, I am a bundle of processes loosely tied up as Kalyanadhi. So the Bodhicaryavatara in this chapter 9 and other wisdom teachings are pointing to this truth of how things really are, how we really exist. But the reality for us is that we habitually see ourselves as fixed beings and as separate beings, fixed and separate entities. That's what our sort of default setting is, to see ourselves like that. And the result of that is suffering. The result of that is suffering. Hello, well done. You managed to do that really quickly. And it's the clinging on to the idea of being a fixed self, being a separate self, when that isn't how things are, that makes us suffer. So I've got a few examples. Aging. So, you know, a natural process that we go through as conditioned beings is that we get old. That's just how things go and how things happening. And it's interesting I'm talking about this because I'm turning 50 this week, which I found quite, thanks Kalyanadhi, a round of applause, which I've had a variety of reactions to. And there's sort of part of me that's like, oh yes, you know, I know some of these teachings, I know that I'm going to get older and I'm sort of all right with that and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And then there are those moments when I look at myself in the mirror and I catch myself and I think, oh, looking old. Or I just sort of see like a fold of skin that wasn't there before, or something that's gone a bit saggier. And then there's this momentary pang in my being of sadness, and actually I think fear. It's that fear at that gut level. Intellectually I can say, oh yes, no, that's fine, but actually no, there is a hanging on in there, a gut level of, oh, I'm going to get old. Actually, I'm going to get old. And of course, in our society, there's this multi-million pound industry desperately trying to keep everybody young. It's bonkers when you think about it, isn't it? It's absolutely bonkers. And yet compelling at the same time, at times. Which should I go to? Well, I think following on from that, so the other thing, about aging is one of the major truth maybe of everything being conditioned and in process is that we will die. We will die. It's the one certainty in our lives that we will die. And for many of us, that's a very, very fearful prospect. And again, as I say, we talk quite a lot about dying and death in Buddhism, and it's like, you can clock it on an intellectual level. It's like, oh yes, I'm going to die. But again, at that gut level, that can be a very, very scary prospect. And yet it's just naturally what's happening. It's naturally what's happening as part of this process. But we suffer because we don't want that to happen. And my experiences of people who've really practiced, often over very many years, is that death holds much less, if any, fear for them. They've really sort of reflected and meditated on things deeply. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. But that fear is sort of dissipated at a particular level for them. And another way, just to think about sort of this sense of self and I and me, and you can think about this maybe more in terms of the ego. But I certainly am sort of very habitually will fearfully guard what I think of as me and who I am and who I want people to think I am, how I want to be seen and thought of. I don't want to be blamed for things. I don't want to look foolish. I don't want to be judged. And I was just very aware of this again this week because I've been doing this talk, and anyone who's been possibly, I might say, unfortunate enough to bump into me in the last couple of days will have got a bit of a sort of earful of like, I can't do this talk. This talk's really difficult. I'm going to look really stupid. I don't know what I'm saying. And it's a really sort of natural thing about, we don't want to be in that position of being judged and looking foolish. But actually, if you look at that, how we've just been talking, there's nothing really there to be judged anyway. It's all a bit of a mental construct of wanting to be a particular way. But it's suffering to us to hang on to that, to want to be seen in a particular way. And actually that's something, again, we've got no control over. I've got no control over what people are going to think or what they're going to, but that anxiety and that worry causes so much suffering, and it takes up so much energy as well, unnecessarily. Yeah. So how do we begin to help sort of free ourselves, actually, and to see this truth, to see this wisdom, to free ourselves from this suffering of clinging on to something that's not actually there in the first place? And it is really important as a start to have a basic intellectual understanding of some of the principles around what I've just been talking about. So some of the things that I've been talking about. And these are called conventional truths. And Buddhism is taught in conventional truths. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a bit. But Buddhism, and I think maybe I've just illustrated that by what I've said, runs way deeper than that. Very easy to pay sort of lip service to these things and say, oh yes, there's no unchanging essence, that's me, I've got that, tick, next. Next thing. But actually, Buddhist wisdom has got nothing to do with the intellect. I'm going to say that again because I think it's quite a important, well, it is fun, you know. Buddhist wisdom has nothing to do with the intellect. And I think that's very strong to hear, particularly in the society that we live in that values the intellect so highly. Like, it's important, we need that intellectual understanding, but it's the absolute tip of the iceberg when it comes to fully realizing the truth of how things really are. And the second verse in this chapter 9 of the Bodhicaryavatara, there are two kinds of truth, conventional and ultimate. Ultimate reality is beyond the scope of the intellect. The concepts of the intellect belong to the realm of conventional truth. So most, if not all of us, need the conventional truths. You can't skip them and sort of end up in reality. I'm not sure about that statement, but I don't think you can. I was listening to a talk by Padma Vajra. He's an order member who lives in Norwich, on this chapter of the Bodhicaryavatara, near Norwich, I should say. And he was saying, you know, the Buddha taught in conventional truths in order to help us discover what lies beyond. And that's why we meditate at deeper and deeper levels on what the Buddha says. And I'm going to say this because I really love this quote. I'm not sure I really understand it, but I'd like to say thank you for nodding so understand. It's like, yes, it's important to say this even if you don't know what you're talking about, Kalyanadhi. So Padma Vajra said that Bhante, founder of our movement, said in a seminar, the ultimate truth is the ultimate truth of conventional truth. The ultimate truth is the ultimate truth of conventional truth. I think that's what I think. So it's like the deeper you go into conventional truth, you will discover reality as it is. So I've got an example. So the Buddha taught, one of the many truths, conventional truths that the Buddha taught was the marks of conditioned existence. So the three things that define conditioned existence: it's impermanent, it's insubstantial, and it's unsatisfactory. You can take any one of these marks of conditioned existence. I'm going to go with insubstantiality. The more you reflect on it, the more you contemplate it, there is what is called a gateway to freedom. I think that's why I really like this teaching. It's a gateway to freedom where you can realize and you can end up in shunyata. I'm going to say what shunyata is in a minute. But just the idea that you can take these truths, they're like fingers pointing to the moon. And the more you contemplate them, the more you digest them, the more you meditate, reflect, discuss, whatever it is that needs to happen. Embody, maybe even in a way, these truths. You come to realize the ultimate truth. So where do you get to? What is this ultimate truth? When you analyze the self into nothing, the mind into nothing, there's nothing intrinsic, nothing fixed. Is there simply nothing? Is that what you get to? Is there like a nothingness? And there's a very clear no to that. It's not nothing, but it is where our language breaks down. The truth of how things really are beyond words and concepts. We've got a word, shunyata, that I just mentioned. It's a Sanskrit word. It literally means emptiness, but it doesn't mean emptiness in a void nothingness kind of a way. And here I'm going to rely on Jnanavaccha again. These are some of the words that Jnanavaccha uses to attempt to describe shunyata. A new kind of consciousness, infinite, utterly free, luminous, expansive, broken free from a very narrow, blinkered understanding into something vast. Truly seeing this, experiencing this is bliss. Kalyanadhi says this is an experiential, intimate, direct perception. It's not an intellectual analysis or an understanding. And just to be, I mean, I think I've already said this, but there aren't really any words that can describe it. All of these words are, again, fingers pointing to the moon. And as soon as you think you've got it, if you ever sort of find yourself thinking, oh, I've got shunyata, you haven't. It's not that kind of a process, from what I understand. And all of our practices, everything we do as Buddhists is leading, helping to guide us and lead us to this deeper and deeper into this realization, into this what really is there, what is reality. And the practices we do right at the beginning that we continue to do throughout our spiritual lives, so the mindfulness of breathing. The mindfulness of breathing, it was said that the Buddha was practicing the mindfulness of breathing when he gained enlightenment. So he gained insight is another word we can use for that. He gained insight practicing the mindfulness of breathing. Metta, I'm just going to quote Bhante on metta. Simply put, in developing metta, we are deepening our emotional involvement with the truth of anatta, or no self. Anatta is another word for no self. Metta means loving kindness, and we have a practice that develops loving kindness. So Bhante says, in developing metta, we are deepening our emotional involvement with the truth of no self. That's a whole other talk, but I would say if you're interested in exploring metta further and its potential, this is a really fantastic book. This is Living with Kindness by Sangha, and we've got some copies in the bookshop. And we can have faith in our practices that they're pointing us, they're leading us towards realizing this ultimate truth. Meditation's preparing our minds to become clearer, less clouded, more subtle, helping us to absorb more and more truths. If we're practicing ethics, we're really starting to break down our sense of me and mine and I, and align ourselves more with how things really are, the fact that we're not separate beings. We're all deeply, deeply connected. Doing ritual, talking with a friend, talking the Dharma with a friend, all of these things just sort of are preparing us, opening us up more and more to see the truth. And the path of the Dharma is steady. The path of the Dharma is steady. So this is Bhante again, Sangha, quoting the Udana. And I've abridged this quite a lot. But just as the mighty ocean deepens and slopes gradually down, hollow after hollow, not plunging by a sudden precipice, even so, the training is gradual, process is gradual. It goes step by step. There is no sudden penetration into insight. It's a steady practice. And you can get those little flashes. And I thought I'd just give just a couple of small examples. So one was really simple, actually, and this was long, would have been when I was in my mid-20s, so long before I came across Buddhism, but just out in nature and up a hill in Wales. And I was at the top of this hill, and there was just this vast expanse before me. And I'd been up there quite a long time. Like, it wasn't like I'd come to the top and gone, whoa. It's like I've been up there quite a long time, but suddenly I looked around and I just had this incredible sense of the vastness around me. And I was suddenly very small in that. And I don't mean small in that in a well, maybe slightly in an insignificant way, actually, but that sort of really strong attachment to me and being in a particular mindset and a particular sort of just dropped away, and I was part of what was around me, and it was extraordinary, and it was huge, and it was vast, and it was free, and that lasted, I don't know, maybe only a couple of seconds actually, and then it closes back down again. But I've always remembered it. It stayed with me, actually. And I think we can often have those experiences of just things opening out and having a different experience other than our habitual one. And it's often in nature, actually, I think, that it can happen. Or a moment around when my mum died. And it's often these big, I think sometimes these sort of strong things that happen in our lives can really open us up a bit. And I just had an experience, and I think I've talked about this before, so apologies if you've heard this before. My mum was buried, and I was sitting in front of my shrine, but I wasn't able to meditate at that time. I was too sort of, just couldn't sit really, but I was just sort of sitting in front of my shrine. And I had this incredibly strong feeling of her skull in the grave, and suddenly it was my skull. And I can't really do justice to this experience, but I knew absolutely I was going to die in that moment. Just, at a totally different level to how I would just intellectually think about that. It's like I was going to die. And that was a moment of real sort of clarity and power. And it was also fairly terrifying, and it closed down pretty quickly. But it's really stayed with me. And I think we can have all sorts of sort of glimmers like that. And I had the most delightful cup of tea with Arta Priya last week. We were talking about this, and I was sort of saying, gosh, it's just such a shame these things close down, and then, you don't stay in these states, and you kind of lose them. And he was just talking about saying, he sees it more as like there's this underground reserve of these moments that happen to us that sort of, they stay with us. And also I was thinking, like that underground reserve, that channel, and as we've just been talking about, we're in process all the time. We're surrounded by conditions all the time. And those little glimmers then play their part in the conditioning of our beings. They continue to work on us and sort of help us see things more and more truthfully, I suppose, or openly. And also just sort of thinking about the imagination things as well. In this same conversation, Arta Priya said, he just suddenly said, imagine what it would be like to wake up one morning with no aversion. It was like, oh, imagine what that would be like. And we sort of had this moment of like, oh, and just this feeling of sort of relaxation and freedom and energy. It's like, just imagine, it's quite a simple exercise, but all that energy we have sort of bound up in all of this sort of defending and not liking and don't want that, don't want this. It's like, it's exhausting actually. Just how free it would be to wake up like that. Okay. Oh gosh, I've nearly finished. Running slightly over time. Just to be really clear, and this is a really important point to make, I think. So it is not about getting lost in some kind of annihilation. So you could say, oh, well, I don't exist and you don't exist. So what's the point in being kind to people? What's the point in ethics, in love? And again, this is quoting from Vidanya's talk on this topic. Just in case we get the idea that this vision of shunyata, of the world as an insubstantial pageant, in case we get the idea that it's about completely detaching ourselves from everything and everyone and not caring anymore, sort of sitting blissfully in some sort of ivory tower, Shantideva, that's the man who wrote the Bodhicaryavatara, well, who spoke the Bodhicaryavatara, makes the point that this liberation has to go along with a realization that we are completely linked to others. We aren't separate from others. and we're not separate from a desire to help others as well, because in a way there's no such thing as other. Actually, we're all so deeply connected. And one of the last verses from chapter 9 of the Bodhicaryavatara says, it's so heartfelt, this: when shall I provide relief for those tormented in the fire of such suffering, with offerings of happiness flowing from the clouds of my merit? When shall I provide relief for those tormented in the fire of such suffering? So I'm just going to conclude. So we can practice Buddhism to become aware, more aware, kinder beings. But there's so much more than that. That is definitely a product of doing the practices, but there's so much more than that. There's the potential of this new way of seeing things, and it's within us all. It's within us all to be able to do this. And that's what chapter 9 of Bodhicaryavatara is reminding us. In a way, this is what it's all about. And I think it can be so important and essential for the aliveness of our practice, to keep this awareness, the potential for insight, the potential of really transforming our consciousnesses. Right in week 1, Arta Siddhi talked about chanda, this fascination, this strong desire. And I think I can certainly really connect to shunyata. It's like, well, what is this? What is it? Like, there is something really fascinating about it. What does it hold? What would it feel like to fully realize that? And I think it can feel very much like we're in the realm of poetry. And Yashodhaka, when he was talking about some of his favorite lines from the Bodhicaryavatara, he talked about, this is from the Puja, the endlessly fascinating cry of wild geese. And the Bodhicaryavatara itself says, where the calls of the geese steal the heart beyond bounds. Where the calls of the geese steal the heart beyond bounds. I love that. And it makes me think of imagining of waking up with no aversion, actually. And like, that would be a heart beyond bounds, wouldn't it? What would that be like? That heart that's beyond bounds. And lastly, as I was doing this talk, I was really reminded of something I heard about 10 years ago when I was on retreat at Tiratnaloka, which is the retreat centre for women who've asked for ordination. And it was Vajratara giving a talk, and she was talking about the cry of shunyata, the cry of shunyata. And I'd forgotten the exact quote, so I emailed her, and she was kind enough to send it to me. So thank you, Vajratara. And basically this quote is saying we wouldn't be able to hear this cry, we wouldn't be interested, we wouldn't necessarily be stepping out on the sort of journey of discovery of Buddhist practice if we didn't have something that longs to be free within us. If we didn't have if we didn't have that the cry of shunyata actually within us, something maybe unconditioned and free already in us that can hear it, that can relate to it. And it can feel such a long way off, in our everyday lives, sort of plodding on. And yet we are the sons and daughters, we are the children of the Buddha. We all have the potential, every single person in this room has the potential to become a Buddha, to become an enlightened being. And this is a quote from the Ratnakarandana Sutta, which Vajratara sent me. Even a worldly person can be a bodhisattva. Truly, O Manjushri, a tiny sparrow emerging from the membrane of an egg without the shell fully broken and without stepping out of the egg utters just a sparrow's cry. Even so, Manjushri, a bodhisattva wrapped in the membrane of ignorance, without breaking the delusion of self or stepping out of the triple world, utters the cry of a Buddha, the cry of shunyata, unconditioned and unconfined. So I'm going to leave the last words to Jnanavacha, and this is what he said at the end of his talk. Keep practicing and see what happens. There we go.